Jamil Jan Kochai is based in California, but he originally hails from Logar, Afghanistan, although he was born in a refugee camp in Pakistan. His debut novel, 99 Nights in Logar, was a finalist for the PEN/Hemingway Award for Debut Novel and the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. Jamil joins me today to discuss 99 Nights in Logar, his family's immigration story, and why this book is so personal for him. Welcome, Jamil, and thank you for coming on Brad Show Live.
Thank you for having me, Brad. It's a pleasure.
Let's get right into it. What is 99 Nights in Logar all about?
99 Nights in Logar, essentially, it starts off sort of as this adventure tale. It's about this young pack of boys in Logar, Afghanistan, which is in the countryside just south of Kabul, our country's capital. And one day their guard dog gets lost in the village, and it's up to this young group of boys to then go after this guard dog. Along the way, though, I think, the story is sort of, it shifts in terms of form and genre, and it becomes much more about storytelling and layers of storytelling and the history of the country and of this particular village itself.
And the main character, Marwan, who is that based on?
A great deal of this novel is autobiographical. Many portions of this novel began as memories, and then they sort of shift as the fictional elements come in. We actually did have a guard dog named Budabash at our compound in the village in Afghanistan, and one day he actually did get lost, but instead of it being like this profound adventure, I ended up just sort of getting frightened. And I remember that sticking with me for such a long time, and I always used to wonder, like, what would have happened if I'd gone ahead on that adventure.
Are there other people in the book that are based on people that you know or people in your family?
The father figure in the story resembles my own father quite a bit. Same with the mother, same with a few of the cousins. So yeah, I would say a few of the characters are pretty strongly resemble actual people in my life.
Tell me a little bit about the adventure that Marwan goes on with the boys.
He has a very contentious relationship with this guard dog. Like any other regular American kid, I think he wanted to befriend this dog. He wanted to have this great time with this dog. But this relationship starts off very poorly. He gets his tip of his finger bitten off, begins to understand this dog's actually much more violent and defensive than he had initially thought. When the dog gets lost, the boys all go out after it. And then the rest of the narrative is sort of all about the effects that this adventure has had on the boys as they're trying to make it back home, and then contending with other issues, sort of having to deal with, the American occupation at large, the ongoing years of warfare, and Marwan's own sort of mysterious family history.
So does this book take place in the present, in the near present?
It's rooted pretty squarely around 2005, 2006.
So what is your family's immigration story? Because you're talking about you in Afghanistan, and I know I'm talking to you in California right now.
My father, he arrived in the States in 83, I believe it was. My mother and my father are both from the same village in Logar, Afghanistan, the village that this book is set in. They lived happy lives there. They were quite content there for many years. But then, of course, the Soviet invasion occurs, and there's a prior revolution. The Soviet Union invades, and all of a sudden, violence erupts all throughout the country. And it hits Logar, Afghanistan, especially hard. There's ongoing series of bombings. There's massacres being committed there. The violence gets to the point where both my mother's family and my father's family, they both end up feeling like they have to flee the country to Peshawar, Pakistan. My father ends up making it to the States through a connection he had with his half-brother who had actually trained in the Afghan Royal Air Force, I believe it was, in Alabama.
How did he get sponsored to come to America?
His half-brother had been in the Afghan Royal Air Force. He was a pilot, and he had been trained in the States, in Alabama, actually. And so through his half-brother's connection to these military personnel in Alabama, they were able to get, these very sought-after American visas at the time. And they were able to claim asylum. And so my father's half-brother, along with almost his entire extended family, was able to make it to Alabama, Mobile, Alabama, of all places. And that's where much of my family still reside. So my father spent quite a few years there in Alabama, about 9 years. When he was about 30 years old, he goes back to Peshawar, Pakistan. He learns about this family there with this eligible daughter who's from his home village. He marries my mother there. He comes back to the States for work, begins our visa application. I'm born in Peshawar, Pakistan. By the time the application for the green card comes through, I'm about 2 years old. And then that's how my mother gets into the country, and I arrive with her.
Now, you grew up in the United States post 9/11, right?
Yes.
How did it affect you growing up in the United States, being Afghani?
It was one of these events in my life that really shaped who I would become as a person. In the years and months immediately preceding 9/11, I did feel, intense sense of Islamophobia. There was bullying at school. From a very young age, I never felt like an American. I think that really shaped how I understood my own identity, my own relationship to Afghanistan, my own understanding of sort of nationalism, of what that can do to people and what that means as an identity. And so growing up in Sacramento, I had a little bit of a rebellious streak. I was often arguing with my history teacher about the history of America's, these invasions that occurred in Vietnam and Korea and wherever else. And so when I began writing this book, and as I'm entering my adulthood and as I'm doing more and more research, I just think I've always had sort of a very heightened idea of sort of the follies of nationalism and of what these sort of national mythologies can do to people and what it can make people blind to. And so I think one of my main intentions with this book especially was to show the ways that the war on terror and, the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, especially the tremendous violence and the terrible effects it's had on these very innocent people in Afghanistan.
Tell us what it's like to be in Afghanistan.
Throughout my life, it has just been a tremendously positive and beautiful experience. I went to for the first time when I was 6 years old in 1999, and that's when the Taliban were in control of the country. And I remember returning home to West Sacramento and telling people about my trip, and I only had good things to say. It was only about how much fun I had with my cousins and these streams that we would swim in and these fields that we would run through and these beautiful orchards that we'd pick apples and berries and these tremendous mountains we would climb, and everyone was so shocked by how much how much I had come to love the country at a very young age. And again, there was always this lingering sense of violence. When we would sleep at night, we would hear like bombs going off in the mountains, and we weren't sure what exactly that was about. And, my uncles were beaten one time for being late to prayer. But again, largely when it came to my direct experience of the country, very beautiful.
Did you ever feel unsafe there?
There were these moments where, in particular, it was actually that time when we went after Budabash, our guard dog, and my cousins went off by themselves, and me and my brother were alone on the road for the first time. We just sat underneath this tree because we were frightened. We didn't want to, get caught up or something like that. But I also remember sitting underneath this tree and the sun is beginning to set, and I'm deeply, deeply afraid. But as the sun is beginning to set, like the entire countryside is being cast with this gorgeous purple hue. And I'm watching the mountains and I'm watching the fields. Everything's being cast with this purplish hue. And I never seen something so beautiful in my life. So it was often this odd mixture of fear, but also tremendous joy and beauty. And that stuck with me for a long time.
What you're describing is a beautiful country with beautiful people that unfortunately has been in a perpetual war since the 70s.
Exactly.
First the Soviet Union, the United States, and everything else. When you wrote your book, did you have to do research on Afghanistan?
I did do quite a bit of research. There were, several important historical texts I was referencing. The secondary research was having these conversations with my family members, doing these interviews, looking back over, photographs and video footage, asking my mother and father to sort of describe what the village was like during their childhood, and then referring back to my own family in Logar as much as possible as well.
Your uncle had gotten beaten up once for not showing up for prayer or showing up late.
Yeah.
What was your family's experience like dealing with the government, the Taliban, who was in charge at the time? In
1999, so the Taliban were in control. At that time, when that particular beating, it sticks in my memory just because I really liked that uncle too. He was actually a very devout man, and so I was very surprised to hear this as well. But he was actually working at his shop, and then he was rushing to prayer to get to the prayer on time, and he got caught up by this Taliban force or whatever it was, and then he was beaten for it. But I will say that within the larger context of everything that was going on, the odd thing was that this period was a period of relative peace and security. And so compared to, the prior era of the civil wars, and then before that, the massacres that are being committed by the Soviet occupation, many people look back on that time rather fondly as a time of like security and peace, and at least someone was in control, even if it was repressive. That was actually part of the reason why we went back in 99, was because it felt like the countryside had retained a certain level of security. Now, again, in 2005, the Americans come in, they devastate the Taliban. It's a very powerful invasion. They retake control. And in 2005, it's a period of relative security again, this time from the American and the government forces. But again, there's also, this lingering sense of repression. There's checkpoints set up all throughout these villages. You would see just, armed men and tanks all over the place.
What was it like being an American and an Afghan in the middle of Afghanistan when the United States is invading?
I did feel incredibly conflicted at the time, but I will say that largely the people were incredibly friendly. They were incredibly loving, despite the fact that I did feel guilty about coming from this country. And I know that in the village, there were many, many people who were opposed to the occupation. But at the same time, I can't recall a single instance of them holding it against me personally.
Would you say a majority of the people, at least that you came into contact with, were they happy? Did they feel that they were liberated from the Taliban?
I think that people felt like they were stuck between a rock and a hard place again. The Taliban are gone. These repressive measures are gone. This intense sense of economic stagnation is beginning to fall away, right? People are feeling like there's jobs coming in. There's money to be made. People feel like they can finally rise up out of poverty. But then you also have this invading force. The Afghan people, and especially people in the countryside of Logar, they're very proud people. They don't want to see an invading army, these odd white guys like roaming throughout their villages, armed to the teeth with whatever weapons they have, and also oftentimes very sort of trigger happy and afraid of the people as well.
In February 2020, the United States and the Taliban, they signed an agreement for bringing peace to Afghanistan after more than 18 years of conflict, actually the longest war America's ever been in.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on this?
At the time, it seemed like something that would have been impossible to have predicted, 5 years ago. I found it to be an incredibly hopeful sign. It felt almost like a miracle to me at the time that this could be possible, that peace in Afghanistan could be possible again.
There are many experts who are saying that the Taliban has already broken their agreements with the United States. What are your thoughts on this?
It has been incredibly disappointing to see the violence ratcheting it up. Now we're entering into the phase where there's direct talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban. At this point, I'm just hoping that at some point both sides are going to realize that this ongoing warfare, it's just leading to more deaths. It's just leading to more loss, and ultimately it's going to benefit neither side.
Let's go back to your novel, 99 Nights in Logar. Somebody reads the novel. What do you want them to learn from this?
That's a good question. I think more than anything, what I want to come through with this novel is not only, for the reader to understand the incredible beauty of Afghanistan, the incredible beauty of this particular village in Afghanistan, but I also want my reader, and especially my American readers, to sort of begin to understand the ways that this occupation and the ways that the ongoing warfare has so warped and so shaped and so negatively impact the lives of the people in Afghanistan, but especially the lives of children. This one of the most heartbreaking things that I think I've sort of had to witness throughout my life is seeing that these cousins who, when I went to Afghanistan, first one in 99, meeting them when they're just like, little children, 6 years old. Then again, when I'm, 12 years old, I'm seeing them like grow into sort of adolescence. And then watching the ways that their lives have been shaped and irreparably altered by this war. It's so deeply heartbreaking to see the ways that violence has changed their lives and forced them into these terrible, terrible situations. And I wanted that to come through in this novel.
One of the chapters in the book is actually written in Pashto. How did that come about?
This was a chapter that I knew was sort of at the heart of the novel itself. It was a chapter that I'd been sort of dreading having to write. It's rooted in this actual tragic event that happened in my family's life. And when I got to that point, I kept trying to write it, and it just wasn't coming through. I couldn't capture that profound sense of loss. I couldn't get the characters right. I couldn't get the movements and the language correct. And I began to realize perhaps this actually isn't my story to tell. Pashto, it's in many ways, it's a dying language. It belongs to people that have been for centuries harassed and oppressed. And what ended up happening was that I asked my father directly, would you actually mind telling this story from your own point of view, word for word? It was difficult for him, but fortunately, he's always been very supportive of my work and of my career in general. And so ultimately, he decided that he would And of course, my father, he speaks Pashto. That's his native language. That's the language he tells all his stories in. And I thought, go ahead and tell it in Pashto. And so he told it in Pashto, and translating it into English, it felt wrong to me for some reason. I couldn't even place what exactly it was, but so much of the novel, it contends with these issues of translation and representation and what can be known and not known. And so I got to the point where I thought, I'm actually just going to leave it in his exact voice, in Pashto, in that script. And that's how I'm going to leave it in the novel. And I think I just went in hoping that like my reader would sort of understand that the story had to be told in this way.
Where can people find out more about you and 99 Nights in Logar?
I've got my own website, www.jamiljankochai.com. That's where I update most of my writing and whatever other events I can do. And then, I'm on Twitter at Jamil Jan Kochai. And those will probably be the two best resources for finding out all things Jamil. I always try to stress as much as possible, seeking out your local independent bookstore. It's also available on bookshop.org, which is a great website, very handy. The proceeds from their website goes to your local bookshops.
Are you working on any other books?
I'm currently working on a book of short stories.
We always like to end our interviews by asking our guests what their American dream is. Tell us what your American dream is.
What I dream about is that someday peace will arrive in Afghanistan and in Logar. And that I hope that as much as possible, I'll be able to go back and live there and to perhaps study or teach there.
Well, Jamil Jan Kochai, thank you very much for coming on. Author of 99 Nights in Logar. Check it out at your local bookstore. His first novel out, and hit it out of the ballpark. So congratulations to you, and thank you for coming on and spending some time with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.